see names, but you don't know what the names represent.
Right.
All right.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I just wanted, before we say anything, to express condolences, or not even condolences, sorrow. I don't know if anyone heard the news of the terrorist attack in Israel today. 3 people were killed in Ariel. And if there's anything that Menachem Begin would speak about, is that you can't have a situation where a Jew is killed and it's just business as usual. That is what he stood for. And that is what he tried to correct. So the struggle does not end, and really, hopefully, the weeks ahead of us are much more peaceful than they've been. To understand who Menachem Begin is really to understand what the modern Jewish community is. It's impossible to understand so many things about the state of Israel, about Israeli politics, and about Jewish identity without understanding the life of Menachem Begin and what he stood for. One example that is simple and obvious to us, but did not exist before him, is the case of the situation where food in the White House could be kosher. That was something that didn't happen before Menachem Begin. He was the first one to insist that the food in the White House be kosher when he visited there. So that's just an example of a small example of how he really changed the conversation about what it means to be Jewish, about being proud and Jewish and open about it. Another example is how we remember the Holocaust, how we stand up to anti-Semitism, his insistence on the Aliyah of Ethiopian Jewry, and many other things that really shaped who we are as a people can be attributed to him. Technically speaking, Menachem Begin was prime minister in Israel for only a bit less than 5 years. So from a political life spectrum, it doesn't seem like he's one of the biggest figures in Jewish history. But if you look at his actions and his legacy, he actually did leave a much bigger impact than many people who, had a longer political life than him. He wasn't limited to politics. Now, I'll just give a content warning, and that is, when you speak about Menachem Begin, it's like ripping off a Band-Aid from a wound. The wound won't heal many times without taking that Band-Aid off, but when you take it off, it hurts. And so many of the conversations about Menachem Begin uncover very painful discussions, whether it's his rivalry with David Ben-Gurion, or his opposition to the reparations from Germany. Many things, the tensions between Sephardi Jews, Mizrahi Jews and Ashkenazi Jews in political Israel and just in Israeli society. A lot of the conversations about Menachem Begin bring out painful conversations, but at the same time, in all of those discussions, there's usually a happy end, and usually he was a healing force. Usually he was a force that really brought more reconciliation than conflict. But it's easy for us to look at it decades ahead. At the time, there were really some really painful exchanges. David Ben-Gurion called him the epitome of a Hitleristic individual. Really, there's some very strong language there. So just warning ahead of time that if you hear that, don't worry, but usually there's reconciliation. So just let's give the background. Menachem Begin is born in 1913 in the city of Brisk, which is a city of where the Soloveitchik family comes from. It's a city with a lot of Jewish history and a history of scholarship. Now, to understand Menachem Begin's childhood is to understand who he was. So unlike David Ben-Gurion, for example, whose childhood doesn't make a major difference in understanding who he is and his legacy, with Begin, you actually need to understand his childhood to understand who he is. Because he grew up in a home where Judaism was very much respected. There was a lot of reverence, but it wasn't necessarily orthodox in the way we know it. There were many aspects of his life that were orthodox and others that were not. Another thing that needs to be understood about his family is that they had to flee during the First World War. They lived in the forest for a year. And so that experience as a refugee also really shaped him, knowing really what starvation is, what it is to live in the forest. That is something that shaped him. After the Begin family flees its hometown of Brisk and lives in the forest for a year, they come back after the First World War, and Menachem Begin goes to Cheder, to a traditional.
Which countries?
You know what? It's like so many things where the borders always shifted around. So today, Brisk, I believe, is in Belarus, but it's on the border there where it could have been Russia and it could have been Poland. So it's sort of, but the answer is either Russia, Belarus, or Poland is where it is. But that was the nature of things. That's how things worked those days. Now, so he's born, thank you though. He's born in Brisk, but we're going to see at the time he had major Polish influences in his life. He was eventually, during the war, the border moved a lot, but eventually when he's growing up speaking Polish, and he's under a lot of Polish influence, but obviously also Russian. So he goes to Cheder, then he goes to sort of a religious Zionist modern Orthodox school called Tachkemoni, where he gets a more general education, and eventually he ends up for high school in a Polish gymnasium. Now, in this gymnasium, he experiences firsthand a lot of anti-Semitism. He's a leader for fighting against it. He organizes the Jewish students to fight back against the anti-Semitism that's going on in school. But some of these experiences really shape him. For example, there was a day that the Polish students held him down and took pork, fat of pork, and they spread it on his lips and kind of were trying to force him to eat pork. And those experiences shaped him in the sense that he always believed that Jews should be able to live proudly and free of such harassment. That's another thing that shaped him, was that he had to take the exams on Shabbat, and it was a whole debate. His father did let him, didn't let him. And you'll see that these things impacted his decisions later when he was asked about issues of religion and state in Israel, which are always a hot button topic. But it impacted his decisions. So unlike David Ben-Gurion, who didn't necessarily have these experiences, these things did shape who he was and his experience, and really are important to understanding who he was later on in life. It's interesting when I'm going to contrast him a lot to David Ben-Gurion, just because they had a lot of rivalry, but they're also representative of two sides of what it means to be Israeli and Jewish. So when Begin is elected as prime minister, he's famously asked by a journalist. Everyone was very concerned. It was after 29 years of only Labor Party rule. And they asked him, what style do you plan on governing with? And he famously said, with a good Jewish style. And so that's who he was. He was more Jewish than Israeli, as opposed to Ben-Gurion, who focused more on the Israeliness than the Jewishness. After Menachem Begin grows up, or as he's growing up, there's a big influence of Jabotinsky, Vladimir Zev Jabotinsky. And Jabotinsky comes to Brisk and speaks there, and Begin is 13 years old, and he's huddled in this theater hall, and he's electrified and transformed, and he really starts being a follower of revisionist Zionism. What does it mean to be a revisionist Zionist? It doesn't mean you change something like when we say revisionist history. It means that you are a Zionist that believes in Zionism that is not necessarily political, the way Herzl believed in, but you believe in a Zionism that is based on force, the way Jabotinsky said that Israel should have a wall of iron around it, and you believe in the full land of Israel, which included both sides of the Jordan. It included famously the eastern side of the Jordan and the western side of the Jordan. That was the ideology of this movement called Beitar, and this is the movement in which Menachem Begin grows up with. Now, it's very interesting. After this, Menachem Begin goes to law school in Warsaw. So you have a lot more of this Polish influence. And here's something that was very much new to me, but it explains a lot, is Menachem Begin's role as a lawyer. He didn't necessarily start practicing as a lawyer, but what happened is being a lawyer shaped who he was. Being a lawyer and the respect for legality had a tremendous impact on who he was later on. I'll just give a simple example, and that is that if you look at the peace agreements with Egypt later on, he spent days and days on every letter, and every word mattered, and it drove Sadat and Carter crazy. But nonetheless, legality and law and what every word means actually meant a lot. And you can give him a lot of credit for that. Meaning, if you compare, for example, the agreement, I don't want to get too political now, but if you compare the agreement of the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt versus Israel and Jordan, where there was a story recently, there was a sunset clause in the agreement with Jordan. Suddenly Israel discovered it's losing all kinds of things because in the original agreement, they wrote it's only going to be for 25 years that Israel keeps that. And surprise, surprise, 25 years went by. And so in that sense, that was something that wouldn't happen under Menachem Begin's watch because he really paid attention to detail. And the lawyer in him is actually much more dominant than you would think. Another thing is that later on, when he's fighting against the British and he's technically a terrorist, he's also very careful about the law. And even when they end up killing, we'll see later, they end up killing 2 British sergeants, it comes with a verdict of their court that they have there. Everything that he does is really a majorly legally thought through issue. So he's always paying attention to detail, and it's important to him that it goes according to the law. When he is in the Polish army, and then eventually he arrives in Israel in 1943, he will not join the Irgun until he is legally discharged from the Polish army. And this is when Poland no longer exists as we know it, meaning Hitler is in control and the government's in exile, but he still doesn't want to break the law. So even though he's known by many at the time as a fascist and a terrorist and all kinds of names, he nonetheless is very committed to the law. Anyhow, since go a bit back, since 1929, he is the head of the Beitar movement in Poland. So Beitar is short for Brit Yosef Trumpeldor. Trumpeldor was a fighter for Israel, and the idea is that it's a movement that believes in achieving the biblical land of Israel through fighting and doesn't have a lot of faith in diplomacy. While he is there, he meets Jabotinsky, and he has kind of a debate with Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky says, we'll have a government in Israel that's unified with the labor. And he turns to Jabotinsky famously and tells him, this is before anything happened in terms of the Holocaust, but still there was a lot going on. He says, I want to remind you that Ben-Gurion refers to you as Vladimir Hitler. But nonetheless, Jabotinsky says, no, we'll be able to coexist with the labor Jews. Don't worry. I remember during World War I when we stood together and fought together in World War I, it's going to be okay. But nonetheless, Jabotinsky is kind of a mentor of his. That being said, it's important to understand Menachem Begin is not a Jabotinsky. He's not a continuation of Jabotinsky. Why? Jabotinsky was not a religious Zionist. His Zionism was not grounded in religion. He actually was not a big fan of religion. He really believed in just this kind of, strong-handed Zionism, right? Just a bit of a more violent version of Herzl's Zionism. And it's a Zionism that says, look, the Arabs will never agree for us to live in the region, and the only way for us to achieve this is fighting. But Menachem Begin is obviously much, much more religious, and that is something that it's important to note that even though he becomes the head of Beitar, and even though Menachem Begin believes in what he coins as military Zionism, nonetheless, his Zionism has many more ideals and much more religion than that of Jabotinsky. Now, he later becomes the head of Beitar in the entire Poland. Believe it or not, Beitar in Poland have 70,000 members, and he's doing fundraising for them, and he's going from town to town, and he meets there the love of his life, Aliza. Now, I don't know if anyone ever met her or heard of her, but he meets this young girl, Aliza, and he writes her a love letter, and one thing leads to the other. They end up getting married, and I guess they live happily ever after. But Aliza is much more cold and calculated, with less of the passion that he has, and that actually helps balance him because he's a much more passionate person and follows his passion much more, where she was keeping things grounded. World War II. Very interestingly, the Nazis come into Poland, and Menachem Begin, even though he's the head of Beitar in Poland, he flees east towards the Soviet bloc, and he ends up in Vilna. Now, it's interesting how this affects him later on, because there are other times where, the Lebanon War and other things where he feels his guilt for abandoning his folks in Poland actually leads him to want to dig in sometimes where he doesn't want to just drop a situation. He goes to Vilna, and a very just interesting story is when the NKVD arrest him. The NKVD is the predecessor of the KGB. First of all, most people arrested by the NKVD do not come back. You will never see them again. But they arrest him and they ask him to sign a confession to participating in the crime of Zionism. Now, Menachem Begin, and here's where the lawyer comes to save him. Menachem Begin says, I will sign a document confessing that I'm a Zionist, but I will not sign a document confessing to the crime of Zionism, since being a Zionist is not a crime. And he insists on that, and they're investigating, they're pressuring him, but that actually may have saved him. He will not sign a document confessing to the crime of Zionism because he says being a Zionist is not a crime. And we'll see that later on in his dealings with the British, where he tells the Irgun, don't recognize the British court. They're not legal here. So he has reverence for the law, but not necessarily the law as it is, as much as the law as it ought to be. So he tells the Irgun members, do not recognize the British courts. So that's something he does. He goes to jail, and he's sent into the Soviet prison in Vilna, and he gets a piece of soap from his wife, Aliza, and he figures this is very unlike her to send me. All she sends me to prison is this bar of soap. He opens it, and there's a piece of cloth there, and the cloth says on it, OLA. Can anyone guess what that means? OLA? You don't need to know Russian or Polish for it. OLA, Ola, meaning I am making aliyah to Israel. Find me, the next place you will find me, like Olim, to go up to Israel. And, Ola, she's going up to Israel, and she lets him know of that. Meanwhile, he's sent to this labor camp in Siberia, and there's an agreement between Russia and Poland that soldiers who are people who are Polish citizens can go fight in some Polish regrouping army to go help the efforts against the Germans. So he's recruited out of this camp in Siberia, again, something that saved his life, into this regrouping Polish army, the Andrus army. For a reason that is really beyond me, they move him down towards Tashkent, towards Iran, Iraq. Somehow there's a regrouping in Palestine, and that's how he miraculously lands himself in Palestine in 1943. Now, again, Begin refuses to just join the Irgun, which would be the natural thing. He's the leader of Beitar. He says, I need to get a legal discharge from the Polish army. And once he gets that, he moves on to be the leader of the Irgun, which is a group of Jews who broke off from the Haganah, wanting to take a harder line towards the British. At the time, both the Haganah and the Irgun were not very much at war with the British, since everyone knew of the Nazi threat. And so there was this kind of ceasefire between the Zionist movements who wanted a Jewish state and the British, because they were recognizing that there's a common enemy that's much more big, and that is the Nazis. But
What year was that?
1943. Now, it's interesting because while Begin is in Israel and Siberia, Israel, his parents are killed by the Nazis. His mom is in a hospital in Brisk. She's pulled out of the hospital and murdered. And his father is led with 500 Jews to the river there. His father realizes what's going on. His father leads everyone in singing Ani Mamin and Hatikva. Their hands are cuffed together, their hands and legs, and they're all thrown into the river. His brothers, everyone is murdered. Now, this is very important to know in terms of how Begin would address things later. The Holocaust had a profound impact on him. So whether you're talking about the agreement between Israel and Germany or anything related to the Holocaust, he had a very different approach than, say, David Ben-Gurion, who didn't see what was going on in Europe, who didn't lose, his immediate family the way Begin did. And also, Begin saw firsthand how the British white paper killed the Jews. People underestimate this. The British, much as I love them today, they committed an unspeakable crime against the Jewish people. They got Palestine in a mandate. It was called a mandate because they had a mandate to establish a Jewish state there. And so they didn't do it. And there was, I mentioned his Beitar movement with 70,000 people. they got 2 visas from the British to let people go to Israel. For 70,000 people, this is while the Nazis are coming in, only 2 were given a visa of where to go. If thousands more would, every single other person that would get a visa to go to Israel, his life would be saved. Begin refused to take one of those 2 visas while he was in Vilna, because he wasn't going to take it when everyone's in danger. But he understood that the British locking the gates of Israel kept all the Jews out and brought them into the arms of the Nazis. And so this was something that, therefore, while the Haganah in Israel was like, we should really work with the British to fight the Germans, he said, there is immediate danger. These people are causing Jews to die by locking the gates.
The United States, though, also limited.
The United States limited, that's one thing. It's terrible, but it's their business. They can say, okay, we don't let Jews in. The British had no business being in Israel to begin with. Why were they even there? Right? They came there in World War I. By the 1920s, they created Iraq, Jordan. They helped create a few other countries in the region. And suddenly, when it came to this tiny strip of land, they said, we can't, even decades later. And so it was a violation of their own Balfour Declaration. It was a breach of the commitments that were made to the Jewish people. And it was a crime because they knew what was going on in Nazi-controlled areas, and they wouldn't give visas. I mean, it's one thing that they did it until 1939, but after 1939, they knew it, and they still didn't give visas. And so Menachem Begin comes, and I'll say in a minute, he declares war on Britain because he knows what's going on, and that every day even if you think about 1944, imagine if Britain would give visas to Hungarian Jews, right? This is a lot of time. This is year after year, 39, 40, 41, 42. By 44, why are they not giving visas to Hungarian Jews? They know that the people are going in the crematorium, and they know.
Didn't that have to do with the oil that they were able to get?
They caved in for various pressures, yeah, but
and also the got their name from Jerusalem, the imam from Jerusalem.
Yeah, Amin al-Husseini, for sure. And the Palestinians also have their fair share in this crime. Yes, absolutely. Palestinian nationalism is for sure.
The British also, so that
yes,
they were trying to keep peace at least on one side.
They had their interest. Everyone has their interest, but the bottom line is they didn't have the right to do that. What were they even doing in the area? So
they defeated the Ottoman Empire when it was one big package, and they just because nobody would question them. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. They defeated them, so we'll stay here, and everything else will be carved into a state.
A few things. First of all, Jews were coming in bigger numbers to the Ottoman Empire than many times to the British Empire. So the organizations, and I'm biased here because my great uncle was Yosef Lishansky, who was in the Neely Underground, who fought against the Ottomans and spied for the British with the understanding that the British are going to establish a Jewish state. And so the British betrayed them, and they took their spying, and the many thousands of Jews, by the way, who joined the British Brigade and helped fight to liberate Palestine, Israel. There was a whole Jewish brigade that fought in 1917. And so they betrayed all those people, and suddenly they said, oh, we're not rushing to give it to anyone. Now, no one was even asking them at that point. They didn't have to establish a Jewish state, but they could have given another, large amount of visas. But, Churchill
is already prime minister.
Churchill's legacy in this sense is complicated because in the early days, the days of the Balfour Declaration, and when he's the minister of colonies, he's very philo-Semitic, but he definitely has blood on his hands in this sense. Now, obviously, there were even more anti-Semitic people than him in Britain, so it's it's not, you can't pinpoint one, but we're going to see. So anyhow, but Begin comes to Israel and he says, we're not waiting to the end of this war, and he declares revolt famously in 1944. He puts out a sort of declaration of war. And what you see is Begin Zionism, which is a new brand of Zionism. It's not Jabotinsky. It is in declaration of revolt. He says, may God, the May God, the Lord of our armies, be with us. He is very religious, and he declares there's going to be a war of the Jewish Yishuv against the British in 1944 before the war is over. Now, it's interesting, again, speaking of him as a lawyer, he sets very strict limits in terms of what you can attack. Only military installations, always a maximum effort to avoid civilian casualties. And he's very, very strict about making sure that it's handled like a professional war and that no civilians are killed. Obviously, since he's declaring a war on Britain, he's a wanted terrorist. And so he goes into hiding. He goes from place to place and has multiple identities. The most famous one, and the one that's favorite, is he goes down as Rabbi Yisrael Sassover. And there's a famous picture of him with a beard and a hat, with his wife looking like a Rebbitzin. And what's funny about it is that he plays the part. He passes for a rabbi. He gives shiurim, and he can really talk the talk. And in a way, he went into hiding, but it also brought out a part of him that who he was. He could pass for a rabbi, and he lived in Tel Aviv as a rabbi. And then he went to various hidden identities. He switched, but one of the things that showed is his rabbinic inclination. Now, a very dark time in our history begins at that time, called the Saison, which is French for season. Basically, it's hunting season, which means the Haganah, the Jewish agency, David Ben-Gurion, the establishment say, these people are breaking our policy. Our policy is we are at peace with the British until the Nazis are defeated. And so these Jews who are joining the Irgun and fighting against the British are undermining our interest, and we will turn on them. And that's what they do. The Haganah, the Jewish agency, get the lists of the Jews that are in the Irgun. There's a lot of bitterness in this. And they start turning them into the British one at a time, knowing that these people will be arrested, sometimes deported to Africa, Cyprus, and that begins. One of the proudest moments of Begin's life is this time where he issues a policy called the Havlaga, which basically means you put up with it. It's the Jewish version of give them the other cheek. And he says, we will not fight back against our brethren. And later on, I'm going to jump a bit, you have the same story with the Altalena. Later on in 1948, first of all, when he was asked at the end of his life what he is most proud of in his whole life, and he has so much to be proud of, the proudest part of his life is the Altalena. And why is that? So in 1948, there's an agreement between the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Lehi, where they're all going to sort of become one army, the IDF. And the only exception that goes in writing to this rule is Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, because most of the fighters in Jerusalem were Irgun members, they are allowed to fight independently. So the Irgun, already months before the establishment of the State of Israel, organized for the procurement of a ship with weapons and 900 Holocaust survivors, Olim, that would come to Israel. By the time they come, already there's been declaration of independence, there's a functioning IDF, and they arrive at the shores of the new state. And David Ben-Gurion says, you need to surrender all the weapons to me because now I'm the prime minister and I'm the commander in chief, and you have to give us all the weapons. But the Irgun say, no, we have our independent units in Jerusalem, and everyone's in desperate need of weapons. That's the sad part of this, because they're fighting with each other, but everyone's in desperate need of weapons, and the young state is fighting for survival. They don't agree. So Begin and the Irgun do something that they think is for sure going to yield good results. They bring the ship right in front of the beach in Tel Aviv, an open view of everyone. So there's all these pictures where you can see the Altalena. It's right in front of where everyone goes to the beach in Tel Aviv. And they say, look, let us, take everything off the ship. But the Ben-Gurion says no. Begin's on the ship, back and forth. Somehow, someone from the Palmach, the fighting unit, which was usually more red communists from the hardcore kibbutzim, shoots at them, and there are a few shots. Eventually, Menachem Begin is on the ship. He screams to everyone frantically. He says, there will not be another second temple, meaning there will not be another episode of the Jews falling apart because we're fighting with each other. He says, even if it's going to cost you your life, do not return fire. And that's what happens. No one returns fire. The ship sinks. He then goes and speaks on the radio for 2 hours. He famously cries. And he says, very famously, Milchemet achim le'olam lo. There will never be a civil war, a war between brethren. And there's even a huge statue of a ship, a monument of a ship that's sinking. And it says, Milchemet achim le'olam lo. We're never going to have a civil war between Jews again. And that was the proudest moment of his life, because he said, in no way, even if they are shooting at us, will we shoot back at another Jew. And if you look at it, besides for the profound historical meanings, because, besides the fact that recognizing what happened during the Second Temple, nonetheless, there's also another element. You look at the Kurds, you look at the Palestinians, and some of the reasons why they don't have a state, even though there's been so many efforts and capital and fighting, it's because one of the reasons is they can't come together. And when one shoots at the other shoots at the other, and they're all shooting each other. And when the UN wants to talk to them, no one knows who to talk to, because are you talking, who's in charge? Are you talking to Hamas in Gaza, Abu Mazen in Ramallah, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad? Who are we even talking to? It's like now we talk about a Palestinian state. Who are you going to give a Palestinian state? Who's in charge, right? You go to any business, who's in charge? And so the ability to come together despite having splintering groups is something that cannot be taken for granted. And it was partially Ben Gurion who takes responsibility for unifying the people. But in a way more than that, it's Menachem Begin who's able to tell his people, even if they're shooting at you, don't shoot back of them. Later on, Ben Gurion told him he was misled. And it's true, there were members of the red kibbutzim who were much more adamant about, destroying what they call the fascist groups and the Irgun. And they were more, determined to hurt the Irgun. But the bottom line is it remains a sore point in Israel to this day. Menachem Begin also said at the end of his life that he didn't cry a lot, but he says he cried twice after the Altalena and at the liberation of Jerusalem. So this was a very, very...
The ship sunk, obviously.
The ship sunk. Most people survived. There were 9 people who were killed.
And all the armaments on the ship?
I believe they sunk, which is insane if you think about it, because here's the young state fighting for survival. Now, that's exactly what happened in the Second Temple. The Romans are surrounding Jerusalem and we were all killing each other. So Menachem Begin said, look, here, at least our side is not contributing. We're not going to shoot back, even if they're shooting at us. And that's what ended up happening. So the Palmach shot at them a few times. People got killed, which is terrible. But there was no counter. It could have become a civil war in the entire Israel. There were Irgun members all over. They could have said, look, you guys shot us. Now we're fighting with you. And he caused that there was no civil war, which is huge.
Who was the armed
Who were the
intended
people who sunk the ship? The people who were shooting it, the Palmach. I don't want to start naming names, but the information is well known and well documented. Correct. There's a very famous picture of the Altalena on the beaches of Tel Aviv, and some people are even sitting in the cafes while it's sinking. It's a sore point, and that's why it's important to understand this, because a lot of these things you cannot fully understand Israeli society to this day without knowing these things. Here we are 77 years later, this is still a sore point. This is not a simple thing.
Do you attribute that incredible leadership quality to just the fact that he was just an innate leader, or was it a combination of leadership and also his background and everything he had gone through and his knowledge of the First and Second Temple? It was just because, leadership like that is extremely, extremely rare, very rare. And yet he rose to the occasion.
Yeah, look, Menachem Begin had a very, very warm Jewish heart for every Jew. And he always cherished every Jewish life. And his family was killed in the Holocaust. And when he would send members of the Irgun on a mission, and one of them would die, a young man, he would cry over it all night. He would hurt about it.
It was actually Jabotinsky that toughened them up.
Jabotinsky was one of the iron fist. Menachem Begin had a Jewish heart. That's I would say, his number one characteristic. And so if I have to attribute it to one thing, it's to his Jewish heart. He said there will not be another civil war. We're not going to fight with each other. And that was his approach.
He had tried to become the premier many times.
Yeah, we'll get to that. Yes.
19 years.
We'll get to that. Yes. So as things continue, just another thing from his that actually speaks exactly to this point. As they're fighting the British, famously, there's the King David Hotel, and he blows it up. By the way, in retrospect, a lot of the actions of the Irgun were marginalized by the establishment. But if you look at the documents, if you look at the history now, there's very strong evidence that if it were not for the Irgun's brutality against the British, there would not be a Jewish state. The British would not leave. It was only because of the attacks like they did that were really, it struck the jugular of the British, that the British were like, we're getting out of here. Another thing that happened was the British, once Menachem Begin and the Irgun stepped up their game and they blew up the King David and attacked British facilities all the time, the British decided they're going to show people who's the tough guy. So they started executing by hanging Jewish young kids who were members of the Irgun. And famously, the members of the Irgun said they would get up in court, they would have the accusations against them read, they would say, this court is illegal, you have no right to be trying us in Israel, and this is illegal, and obviously you can't help yourself if you're not willing to defend yourself, and often they were hung. The most famous of these were two fellows named Moshe Barazani and Meir Feinstein. And these two were taken by the British. The British were going to execute them. Someone smuggled inside an orange a grenade, and they were going to blow themselves up at the execution. On Shabbat, before famously Rabbi Aryeh Levine visited them, he would always go visit the prisoners. And they realized that he is going to insist on being at their execution. He's not going to let them be executed alone. So they realized they can't blow up their grenade on their executors, and they killed themselves while they were in the British prison. They put the grenade between their hearts and they blew themselves up. Famously, this story made a huge impact on Begin in many ways. When people started speaking about tensions between Sephardim and Ashkenazim, when some people downplayed the role of Mizrahi Jews in fighting in the IDF, he said these two people, one was Iraqi, one was Ashkenazi, but one heart. He used it almost as a metaphor. We're one heart, one nation. And he said, look, when those boys stood heart to heart, one was Iraqi, one was Ashkenazi, we're one people. And at the end of his life, he ordered to be buried not in Mount Herzl. He was not buried in Mount Herzl with other Israeli prime ministers. He was buried next to Feinstein and Barazani in Mount Olives. It had such a profound impact on him. So this was a big story. Now the British decided they're going to show that they're even tougher, which was not a great idea. And then even though there was strong international pressure, Jewish pressure not to continue with these executions, the British insisted. And so the Irgun said, you know what, you're going to do that. We're going to take also the path of tough people. And they kidnapped two British sergeants. And they said, if the British hang our people, we will hang them. And that's exactly what they do. Menachem Begin didn't make that decision. And here's something very important. He ended up having to defend it, but he didn't make it. And throughout his life, there were other times where he had to defend decisions that he didn't make. The Lebanon War, where Ariel Sharon got him into much more of a conflict than he had imagined. Nonetheless, he had to live with those consequences, and he never stepped down and pointed a finger at someone else. He ended up standing with it. Now, you mentioned the Knesset. There's a famous joke. So once Begin is elected, he's a member of the opposition, and he runs again. I believe he runs 9 times until he finally wins. So there's a joke about a man standing in Tel Aviv right outside the Likud or the Cherut Center, and he's standing there and he says, Begin for prime minister. And someone comes and says, you're doing this all morning, all day, all night. What are you being paid? He says, thank God I'm being paid. And they say, how much are you being paid? He says, every time I scream, begging for prime minister, I get 1 penny. And they told him, that's not a lot of money. He says, yes, but it's good job security, meaning I'll be here for the rest of my life. And so people didn't think that he would win, but he ended up winning eventually in 1977. Another very good story. He ends up winning against the Labor Party, which is called the Avodah. And my cousin, Simcha Lyons, once met Menachem Begin, and he said, I want you to know, I think of you every single Shabbat Mevarchim, when we bless the new month. So he says, why? He says, because we say, Hotzianu mi avdut lecherut. So avdut means slavery, but it also is a pun on avodah, which was the later Labor Party, and cherut is the party of Begin. He says, you took us out of avdut to cherut. So he ended up having a long political career. But actually, once the elections go by and he's a Knesset member, he's marginalized inside cherut. He's focused on his book. And it's not until 1952 that he gets dragged back into politics, when members of the Cherut party and other parties, by the way, left and right, hear of Ben-Gurion's plan to have reparations from Germany. They go and call him. They realize that he's the only voice who can really speak strongly about this because he was so outspoken on it. And he's recruited. There are other people on the left, even the far left, like Abba Kovner, who are also vehemently opposed to the agreement. If you look at what the name of the agreement is in German, it's Wiedergutmachen. You know, the Germans, they put together a lot of words. So Wiedergutmachen means making good again, meaning, you know, let's be friends again. So this wasn't reparations. Reparations is not a good translation. It was called Wiedergutmachen. Let's make good again. And this is actually the only time that Menachem Begin did incite to violence. And he goes and he speaks in the most forceful way possible. He uses a lot of religious texts. He refers to Germany as Amalek. He says, you will be crossing out a whole parsha in the Torah of forgetting what Amalek has done for us and making peace with the most evil. And he speaks out in really, really strong terms. The Knesset is sacked after his speech. They throw tear gas at the protesters, but they don't realize that then the wind takes the tear gas. The tear gas then goes inside the Knesset and goes all over the Knesset members, and he's expelled from Knesset for 3 months. He speaks out very strongly, and it's important to understand the differences here between Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin. First of all, Ben-Gurion has good arguments in the sense that he says, if we let them keep the money, then we're rewarding the Nazis for what they've done. And also, if we get the money, we can give it to Holocaust survivors. It's their money and they deserve it. Also, a Jewish state will prevent further Holocausts and tragedies against the Jewish people. So Ben-Gurion has good arguments. But a difference is that Ben-Gurion didn't lose his father and siblings and mother in the Holocaust. Begin did. And it's the people who did lose that really are the most outspoken. Just to understand what was going on then in Israel, there's a very famous violinist, I forgot his name. He played some piece by Strauss, who's a German musician. He played it in Tel Aviv, and someone waited for him outside with a metal pole and broke his arm. So there were very strong feelings. Remember, this is not even 10 years after the Holocaust. And so Begin is very forceful, very strong. And he says he looks, now another difference between him and Ben-Gurion, Ben-Gurion has to pay the bills. And they have hundreds of thousands of Jews coming to Israel. The population is doubling. They have Jews from North Africa, from Arab countries. There's tons of people. And if you don't have food, the country could starve. And so Ben-Gurion says, I'm going for this. And but Begin says, look, remember, Hitler was voted by the German people. He says every single German is a murderer. Adenauer is a murderer. He really does not spare any strong language on this. And then he says, I said in 1948 not to have a civil war, and now I'm going to say there will be a civil war. And he kind of loses it, I would say, even to me, who, you know, I definitely take strong positions in terms of not forgetting what the Germans and other European countries did, but he really, he goes all out. And I think a line that's fascinating to me is that he turns to the Arab Knesset members and he says, you should not be voting. I'm asking you not to vote in this vote on the reparations for Germany, because these are not your people who were killed. These are not your families. Have the decency to leave it to us. This is not anything for you to vote on, which is a very, very powerful, just moment to remember in terms of who he was. Another just important perspective of how Menachem Begin ended up. First of all, this can continue for 10 hours. We can talk about him, so I'm going to try and get everything in the little time that we have left. But in the 1960s, Menachem Begin, leader of the opposition, known as a radical, a man of war, a fascist, he notices that Israeli Arabs are living under military rule. They are still under military rule, and he's actually the person who pushed for Israeli Arabs to live no longer under military rule and with full civil rights. In 1977, he ends up being elected. Now, what's fascinating in terms of understanding politics today is what some call the alliance of the oppressed. Menachem Begin finds extremely a warm and welcoming audience in Mizrahi Jews who feel very oppressed, who feel very discriminated against by the Ashkenazi elite establishment. And he also finds the religious, who are usually with members of Mapai, he finds them to be a good audience. And the fact that he's so warm about his Judaism, and that his Judaism actually is more Sephardic than Ashkenazi, in the sense that Ashkenazi Jews, sometimes they're like, well, I'm not keeping Shabbat, I'm not this, I'm not that, I might as well not be affiliated. He has no problem being very religious in some ways, and it doesn't mean that if he's not religious in other ways, he has to quit. And that's something that you have more in the Sephardic community, where people can be traditional, but still strongly affiliated. And that's how he bonds with a lot of people. The famous story, when he's having coalition negotiations, the religious parties are all screaming, just like they are right now when they're negotiating. They're all screaming and yelling, we're not going to go into the government, and da-da-da-da. They're making a whole brouhaha against him. And he looks at the watch and he says, friends, the sun is almost going down. Did everyone hear daven mincha yet? Yeah? You didn't daven mincha? Well, let's have a minyan. And they have a minyan and they daven mincha. And sure enough, after everyone daven mincha, they calmed down and they got together with him. So in that sense, he was able to use his familiarity with the Orthodox and Jewish tradition as a bridge to really build coalitions, which is essential to understanding what's going on in Israel now in terms of the covenant almost between the Likud party and the religious parties and the Sephardic community. That's something that Begin created. In his first year, he hears about the civil war in Vietnam, and he hears that there are Vietnamese people who are put in the ocean and starved to death, literally. The men are given no food, and the women are given 1 teaspoon of water a day. That's it. And he hears there's an Israeli ship there. He orders it to pick them up. They bring them to Israel, and he gives them full citizenship. And so in that sense, the man who was sort of a man of war and everything, actually today, there's not a single person, even on the most extreme left of Judaism or Israel, who does not revere Menachem Begin. The person who was first thought of as a man of war, of a man who speaks very strongly, ended up being the man who gave Israeli Arabs full civil rights. It's the man who signed the peace agreement with Sadat and Egypt, and it's the man who brought a lot of reconciliation. He's really a true man of reconciliation. I just want to read his words, end off with this. I want to read the words that he read when he received the Nobel Prize after the agreement with Egypt. He says, "Peace is the beauty of life. It is sunshine. It is the smile of a child, the love of a mother, the joy of a father, the togetherness of a family. It is the advancement of man, the victory of a just cause, and the triumph of truth." And that really was who he was. He was shaped by caring for others, by wanting peace, but also he was shaped by being Jewish, by the Holocaust. Many of his decisions are based on his experience as a Jew who suffered from anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. One more thing I should have mentioned earlier is the Begin doctrine with regard to nuclear weapons. When he hears that Iraq has nuclear weapons, he's the one who goes and decides to bomb the reactor, and that's now called the Begin Doctrine. So later Olmert hears that there's a nuclear bomb in Syria in 2008, I believe, and he bombs their reactor. And that is something that shapes even him going into Lebanon, the idea that no Jew should live under existential threat. Sometimes it didn't work for him, like in Lebanon, he ended up getting stuck too deep in the mud. But in the case of the Iraq nuclear reactor and other things, it definitely shaped who he was. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And there's so much more to say. Yes.
Begin Center in Jerusalem.
Yes.
And they played his acceptance speech that he wrote himself and he delivered when he was elected Memshalah after 9 years. He never once mentions himself. He's
a humble man.
He mentions his parents.
Yeah.
He mentions Jabotinsky. He mentions his fellow Irgun fighters. He mentions his teachers.
Yeah. He
never mentioned himself once.
Wow. Very special man. And when he retired, he didn't have a penny. He went to live at his daughter's house. Yeah. He had nothing. And and in a way, a lot of his victory, one more thing is his victory was a victory for the oppressed, not just because of the Sephardic religious or whoever it may be. The Irgun were oppressed. The victims of the Irgun, people who died fighting the British, if you were in the Haganah, you got a whole IDF memorial. If you fought while fighting for the Irgun, you were nothing. My own great uncle, Yosef Lishansky, who fought for Nili, was not brought to burial in Har Herzl until after 1977, after Begin came in. No, this is even before the Irgun. It was people who were on the outs with the establishment of Hashomer HaTzair. He was on the outs with Hashomer HaTzair. And so in a way, he really, when he got elected, so many people who previously felt like the oppressed felt a huge amount of relief. But and that's why to understand Israel, you need to understand Begin. Yeah.
Also, that famous phrase that he uttered to Carter.
Which is,
didn't he say that?
We've been tertiated. No, we've been tertiated.
A lot of he had a lot of good there's a lot of good sayings. He had a tremendous sense of humor, even though later in his life he did have depression. But I'll tell you two stories. One is famously when there was the Sabra and Shatila massacre, and Israel was blamed all over the world for the fact that Christian phalangists killed the Muslims. He famously said, "Goyim kill Goyim and they blame Jews." That's one thing that he famously said. And then someone I met who knew him, very close with him, Hart Haston, said that he was with him after he retired. He retired very suddenly from depression when his wife died. And a journalist came and said, "Mr. Begin, why did you retire?" So he said, "Because I'm old." So he said, "But Mr. Reagan is not much older, but he's the same age and he's still working." So he says, "No, Reagan is a gesunte goy." And the guy had to turn to the reporter and he says that Mr. Reagan is in better health. So he really his everything that he did, even though he was prime minister for relatively short, he reshaped Israel, he reshaped the Jewish people, he reshaped the Middle East with his peace with Egypt, and really there's a lot to learn from him. Very inspiring man. All right, thank you so much. Thank you. All right. Yeah, no, you can do a Begin for days and days. I think her last name is Levy, of a great a Jewish woman also who survived the Holocaust. We're going to be doing this woman, Levy, and women, just in general, Jewish women who great scientists, etc.
Rosalind, what was Rosalind's last name? She ran the chemistry program. What was that?
Robert,
I didn't.
sorry, do you want to answer this question here?
What is it?
I don't know if you want to answer it in front.
All right.
Yeah.
That's where this.
I mean, it's hard to answer. One just question from the audience is how would a lot of people felt foreboding when he was elected, and then how does that impact today's elections in Israel? Look, with Begin, there were a lot of people who were very afraid of him. There were a lot of people who said when he's elected, it's the end. And you do hear those voices now when Israel's government is elected. I can't tell the future, but maybe they'll disprove the fears, maybe not. But he definitely disproved anything that people were concerned. Today he's a hero and accepted by all. But I'd like to also thank everyone online for joining us and appreciate your questions. If you want, you can also email questions after this. And thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you so much.